So yeah, I'm Avni. I am one of the compliance attorneys at Lidl US. COVID-19, certainly a game changer for all businesses, but very specifically in the retail sector, and even more so, I would say, for the grocery sector. As some of the speakers have mentioned, it definitely sped up some activities that were kind of already in the works, such as the password piece that last speaker just talked about. Um, but we also saw firsthand sort of what the panic shopping, the demand shifts, and the rise in digital payments, what that did to our fraud prevention efforts, and how we may have had to tweak that and put a greater focus on certain areas that we may not have highlighted as much as before. So I'm just going to start off by just taking a quick look at what our typical fraud profile looks like. It's typically focused on our vendor and supplier risks. So typical concepts of conflicts of interest. Certainly, we have a wide variety of vendors that we work with. So anything from tomatoes, carrots to, actual structural support and construction items when we build our stores. So there is a risk of kickbacks, for example. In terms of our mitigation and prevention efforts, we do conduct the normal risk analysis that all businesses should and typically do conduct as part of our procurement function, making sure we have that due diligence process in place and a strong one at that. And a lot of these topics, the whistleblower program is certainly one of those mitigation efforts. Um, and that would be across the board for, any of our risks. So just kind of going down the line with, certainly on the grocery front and retail front, that supply chain and distribution side, making sure we're not dealing with product substitutions. And certainly with that increased demand, that was a greater concern, making sure that we were getting the products that we were promised. Making sure those process controls have been followed and are in place and people are aware. And I'll talk about this a little bit later on, but with the increased demand, that also meant there was also increased turnover, not just on the vendor side, but also for us as employees. Once you had COVID kind of taking a lot of people offline from the stores, obviously to take care of themselves, that also means you have newer people. They don't have the same background on what our processes are. So that's certainly a risk that had to be accounted for. And turnover is a risk, on a good day, never mind during a pandemic. So next up in terms of inventory loss and shrink, any retailer has this as top of mind, and that can be from the employee, the consumer, point of sale. Gift cards is a significant one. AML concerns with regards to gift cards. There are significant organized crime rings focused exclusively um, on gift cards. So making sure we have the appropriate loss prevention controls and tracking of those fraud trends. In terms of our, food and product safety, that's really the heart of our business. So making sure, our products are labeled appropriately, there's no safety concern to the consumer. And to mitigate that, making sure we have the appropriate QA measures in place. We have that relationship with the appropriate government authorities. So if there is an issue, we are able to pull that product off the shelf. And then cyber crimes. I am a lawyer, so we're not known for being, technical experts by any means. So, cyber crimes, it's impacted our business. It's impacted probably all businesses, just in terms of not only data theft, but phishing attempts, and making sure that we have those internal controls, the appropriate forensics, and that we're conducting the appropriate testing as well to make sure that there aren't any gaps. Lastly, the bribery and corruption side, we do work with government officials as part of our licensing arrangements, and we're exploring new markets. So we do need to analyze those key touch points with, government officials, for example. Um, and I think for that piece of it, that tends to be the most human, there tends to be the most human level of risk there, when it comes to bribery and corruption. And so, in terms of mitigation and prevention, it's really that communication aspect that we really target. Um, those internal controls are vital, but if people don't know what they're expected to do and how they're expected to behave, that kind of puts us a few steps behind. So, kind of taking a turn as to, how does COVID impact all of this? And, the handy fraud triangle here that we're all painfully familiar with. Um, I just wanted to highlight some key areas that, for our business, we really noticed and paid extra attention to, on how and where we might want to focus our efforts. So, certainly the personal stress, the professional stress, that pressure for financial results. We are a grocery retailer, but there are certainly a number of retailers that weren't, you know, as well positioned financially and were caught off guard. And, there wasn't much they could do in terms of maintaining their financial results if there's a shutdown in your entire country. So, that pressure to contract with more and more suppliers to do that quickly. I know a number of the speakers have mentioned speed. How can technology help facilitate, you know, the speed at which we do business with people in a risk reduced way? So that certainly, all fits into that motivation aspect. Most of us are remote. I think all of us are remote right now. So, that certainly is a significant factor in terms of how we assess fraud. Without that in-person interaction, I mean, I know we have some manual processes, and I'm sure most businesses have some element of manual processes. How do we alleviate, the burden and the risk of those manual processes when everybody is remote? um, that quick decision making. I think I've probably gotten more email traffic in the past, 10 months now, are we on, than I have probably the 2 years prior, just because it's the quickest way to communicate and send information, but you're also trying to move fast, make quick decisions, and you run that risk of bypassing those controls that are in place. And, finally, we do have a significant communication shift, how we communicate with each other, how we communicate with our vendors specifically. That culture shift, many companies were very much a FaceTime, they work together in person well, and then to so quickly adjust, that does take a hit to the overall culture and the compliance culture that you have. So you have to work extra hard to kind of rein that back in and make sure everyone is on the same page. And then, finally, in terms of just focusing on that self interest versus the corporate interest piece in terms of rationalizing behavior. Um, I think the ACFE stats are something like 40 some percent, or most, actually more than that, fraud is committed internally, right? And so combine the self-interest and financial need with being remote, it's a bit of a recipe for disaster if you don't take a minute to really evaluate what your fraud prevention program is, and identify those gaps. So, kind of returning back to our fraud risk profile, how does COVID fit into that? You know, what does it highlight? What makes certain topics worse for us as a business? So certainly the vendor side of it, we just have an enormous amount of vendors that we work with, and that increased as demand increased. So if we did not have an appropriate due diligence process, and we then had to evaluate that to make sure that it was timely, because you don't want to run the risk of employees blowing through or blowing past that entire process just to get, a certain vendor through the door. And that is far more likely to happen, in a heightened, pandemic era, as it was prior to that. And that's really where I think technology can play a significant part, is that due diligence process, to make that more automated, take it out of the hands of a handful of employees, starting that off and following that end to end. Um, if as a business I'm looking at something, like I think that's really a target for improvement for a lot of businesses, is that due diligence process and how we can include technology in that. Just kind of going down, diversion of products, that was certainly a concern. Um, there was a point, and it's alleviated a bit now, where businesses were essentially fighting for the same suppliers. So, if we had a relationship with someone as a vendor, they may be going somewhere else, or, then leaving us in a bind. So making sure that we are getting what we contracted for, and, no less, that was certainly a concern. Um, One of the biggest concerns we've had besides the vendor piece is that inventory loss. I think there have been a number of articles on, product theft, financial theft, and theft from the company in terms of invoice approvals. And this kind of ties over to the cyber crimes aspect, which has been huge. The volume of malware, ransomware, the phishing attacks, data breaches. I think in our world, we saw it most with invoicing and account changes. And that's really where technology speed and accuracy could really improve that entire process and those mitigation efforts when it came to cybercrime. At least I would say for the retail sector, and I'm sure for multiple business sectors. So, I mean, lastly, in terms of bribery and corruption, um, higher levels of the same. That we certainly had retailers that if they, let's say, were eligible for some government programs, that opens up a whole pool of fraud risk, and making sure that, they're not making incorrect claims to get that money, et cetera. So for bribery and corruption, it just kind of took it to another level. I don't think we necessarily saw an entire, different bucket of types of fraud. It was more increased amounts of what we've typically seen. So I know we're kind of close on time. I just wanted to focus specifically on a couple of the specific risks that I went through, and just in terms of, what would a retailer do, and what kind of considerations should you have to account for that. And so the vendor supplier piece was so key for our business, and I think for a lot of businesses. So conducting another risk assessment was so vital. We should be, as a business, conducting risk assessments regularly anyway, but especially so when it comes to times of massive change. And this certainly, counts as that. Um, we focused on, associated risks of, increase in e-commerce, and again, that third party due diligence piece. Making sure, do we have a healthy balance of manual and automated processes? Um, there's pros and cons of both, but I think each business has to kind of look at what is the point at which we're maximizing the benefits of each. What can we, divert resources to think of the long game in terms of fraud prevention. So part of that was also focusing on our reporting and monitoring capabilities. What tools do we have right now, and what tools can we look to in the future to have that real-time alert system? Um, you know, Time is of the essence in any kind of fraud issue. And so making sure that not only are we preventing it from the get-go, but that we can play, defense once, something does happen before it gets even worse. And finally, that communication piece, it's near and dear to my heart. I worked for about 9 years and sat under a communication practice, and I could really see the impact of what having a strong communication um, mechanism and policy and program can do on employee behavior. So making sure that we're doing a pulse check on employee well-being. Employees know what to expect in terms of what they should do, not do, what their expectations are in being a partner in fraud prevention. And kind of along the same lines here, with cyber crimes, similar concepts in terms of that current state risk assessment, really focusing on those data processing agreements, making sure from a contractual standpoint, we are looking at where the data is going, what protections do we have as a business if something should go wrong. Um, Again, I think the last speaker mentioned, no one wants to add on another layer of protection if we don't, and because that does add time. But sometimes, for us as a business, we do need to add on an extra layer, just depending on the risk level. Making sure that we are appropriately evaluating, how many levels we have for a given risk. And I think for cybercrime, we'll probably see an uptick in the tools at our disposal and the tools that we're going to be using to mitigate those risks. And then finally, that rollout again of, enhanced and targeted communications. Like we really do focus on, does somebody know if they get a request to change an account, do they know exactly who to flag this to? Beyond just following what the protocol is, are they aware of some common things to look for? Are they aware that they should immediately, contact a certain team? Um, and so, from a legal standpoint, that's also really important to me because you want to be able to get ahead of it and know what's going on and get those details up front. So, making sure everyone is really on the same page in terms of what they need to be doing and what tools there are at their disposal. Okay. And just kind of wrapping up in terms of, the post-COVID fraud prevention considerations, there are certain elements that I think, the ship has sailed on remote work. So making sure that you have the appropriate policies in place and, making sure you have the right long-term policy adjustments and taking into account, all of these various stakeholders. I think we had a speaker that, said sometimes companies have, 50 different policies on essentially the same thing. You know, you need to focus on what the cohesive policy is going to be that mitigates risk in a holistic way versus in a myopic way. And that also goes along with being good business partners internally and then knowing when you need to go to an external resource. Like I said, I'm an attorney, I'm not a technical expert, but if there is, if I see an opportunity for something where a tool would be helpful, I should be um, I should be pulling someone in that can help me navigate that. And that is what a good, risk professional would do. And I think just, finally, in terms of the training and communication piece, it had become a little bit more difficult once we were all remote. But I think there are so many different tools available to us now. And I think that's the piece that gets forgotten a lot is, everyone gets into this mode of creating the tools, creating the controls, making sure the right documentation is in place. But I think what's really key for any kind of fraud prevention strategy is getting that buy-in and support of everyone around you in the business. And so that targeted training and communication, I think really pulls all of this together. And I just wanted to wrap up. This is one of my favorite quotes, and I think it's really key for the current time frame in terms of making sure that you're not spinning your wheels when there's a crisis. That you've been doing this and conducting those risk assessments in advance, so then you're ready when there is a crisis. Thank you.